It didn't happen with a speech. No balcony appearance. No solemn address to the nation. It happened with a pen. That's the unsettling part. Because when real power moves, it rarely announces itself. It just moves. Quietly. Deliberately. And by the time most people notice, the outcome is already baked in. But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. So here's the question that's been hanging in the air, unanswered, uncomfortable. What if the most decisive moment in Harry and Meghan's long standoff with the monarchy wasn't an interview, or a memoir, or a documentary, but a signature placed on paper when no one was looking? Today, the focus turns to King Charles III, not as a father, not as a figure caught in family drama, but as a constitutional actor, operating inside a system that doesn't rely on emotion, explanation, or apology. A system that waits, and then acts. For years, the story has been framed as noise. Accusations and counter-accusations. Public grievances answered with silence. Many assumed that silence meant weakness, or avoidance, or paralysis. But what if it was none of those things? What if the silence was procedural? Because while public attention stayed fixed on interviews and headlines, something else was moving in the background. Slowly, methodically. A bill. Dry language. Legal authority. The kind of mechanism that doesn't trend on social media, but carries consequences far beyond a news cycle. And suddenly, the narrative shifts. This is no longer about popularity or perception. It's about status, protection, and what happens when the framework that once insulated Harry and Meghan begins to change shape beneath their feet. Here's the contradiction that makes this moment so volatile. The monarchy appears calm precisely because it doesn't need to defend itself. Institutions don't argue. They endure. And when they decide to respond, they don't do it loudly. They do it in ways that are very hard to reverse. Ask yourself this. If titles were merely symbolic, why would removing them matter at all? The answer, inconveniently, is that they've never been just symbols. They are currency, access, a form of quiet credibility that opens doors without asking permission. Take that away, and the landscape changes. Not instantly, but permanently. This is where Prince Harry and Meghan Markle enter a far more precarious chapter, not one defined by outrage or rebuttal, but by what happens when the rules they once relied on are no longer guaranteed. And the most unsettling part? The public version of this story is incomplete. What's been discussed openly is only the surface. The real implications, the timing, the coordination behind this move, those details remain just out of view. Because the signature may be dry ink on paper. But what it sets in motion is anything but. And once you see why this bill was allowed to surface now, at this exact moment, the next chapter becomes impossible to ignore. So why now? That's the part that doesn't sit comfortably. Because bills like this don't suddenly appear out of nowhere. They don't materialize because of one bad headline or a single explosive interview. They exist long before the public ever hears about them. Drafted, parked, left dormant, waiting. The real question isn't what this bill does. It's why it was allowed to move when it did. Here's something worth sitting with for a moment. Institutions rarely act when emotions are highest. They act when the noise dies down, when outrage becomes background hum, when the audience is distracted, fatigued, or convinced that the story has already peaked. That's when paperwork becomes powerful. What's striking about this legislation is how unremarkable it looks on the surface. No dramatic language. No overt targeting. Just a procedural expansion of authority. A clarification, really. Who holds the power to remove titles? Under what circumstances? And through which mechanisms? Dry? Technical? Almost boring. And that's precisely why it's dangerous. Because when power is exercised loudly, it invites resistance. When it's exercised quietly, it becomes precedent. Ask yourself this. How many times have people said, they'll never actually do it? Strip titles. Cross that line. Trigger that backlash. That assumption depends on one flawed idea, that this would be done as punishment. What if it isn't? What if it's being framed, internally, as housekeeping? A system tightening its own definitions, reasserting boundaries that were allowed to blur, creating a legal framework not just for today's problem, but for future ones that haven't even arrived yet. This is where the narrative subtly changes. Because once you see this move as structural rather than emotional, it stops looking reactive. It starts looking planned. And that raises an uncomfortable possibility that this bill was never about Harry and Meghan alone. Think about it. Monarchies don't like improvisation. They prefer rules, predictability, levers that can be pulled without spectacle. If a line is going to be enforced, it has to exist clearly first, which means someone, somewhere, asked a very specific question. What happens if a senior royal operates entirely outside the institution while continuing to benefit from its symbols? And instead of answering that question in public, they answered it on paper. This also explains the timing around King Charles III. Because whatever else he is, he's methodical. His reign has been defined less by dramatic gestures and more by quiet recalibration, slimming down the monarchy, redefining working roles, removing ambiguity wherever possible. In that context, this bill doesn't feel impulsive. It feels aligned, which leads to another question, one that doesn't get asked often enough. Who pushed for this to move forward now? Because legislation like this doesn't glide through on autopilot. It requires agreement, coordination, a shared sense that the moment is right, that resistance will be manageable, that the public response will be muted, and maybe that calculation is already proving correct. Because while headlines flare briefly, there's no mass outrage, no unified backlash, just a low, uneasy murmur, almost as if people were prepared for this, or tired enough to accept it. And if that's true, then the bill isn't the story. It's the signal. A signal that the institution believes the risk of acting is now lower than the risk of continuing to wait. But the most revealing part hasn't even surfaced yet, because the real impact of this move isn't immediate. It unfolds slowly. In conversations not had, invitations not sent, doors that stop opening without explanation. And once you understand who stands to lose the most from that kind of quiet shift, the next question becomes unavoidable. What did the palace see coming that made waiting no longer an option? Here's the uncomfortable truth most coverage schemes past. If this power existed, or could be shaped into existence, why wasn't it used sooner? That question keeps circling back, because on the surface, the delay looks like hesitation, or mercy, or fear of backlash. But the longer you sit with it, the less convincing those explanations become. Delay, in institutions like this, is rarely indecision. It's incubation. For years, the palace absorbed pressure without responding in kind. Interviews landed. A memoir detonated. Documentaries rolled out globally. Each moment was framed as the breaking point, the line that couldn't be crossed. And each time, nothing happened, at least nothing visible, which led many to assume the monarchy was cornered, that it had lost control of the narrative, that silence meant surrender. But silence can also mean observation. Because here's the irony that's easy to miss in real time. Every public escalation made the private case stronger. Each declaration of independence underscored a contradiction the institution could quietly document. Operating outside the system, while continuing to trade on the authority of the system, that tension doesn't explode. It accumulates. And the longer it accumulates, the easier it becomes to justify action that looks measured rather than reactive. This is where timing starts to make sense. Not emotionally. Strategically, public appetite matters. Early on, any decisive move would have been framed as cruelty, retaliation, proof of the very accusations being leveled. But narratives age. Fatigue sets in. Audiences move on. Certainty erodes. Ask yourself this. How many people still feel shocked by royal controversy? Exactly. Which creates space. Space to act without igniting the firestorm that once seemed inevitable. And then there's the role of King Charles III himself. Not as a personality, but as a transitional figure. His reign has been about narrowing definitions. Who represents the crown? Who doesn't? Who carries weight? And who exists adjacent to it? From that angle, this bill doesn't read as punishment. It reads as alignment. A cleanup operation designed to bring the legal structure in line with the reality that's already been playing out. And reality, by this point, is hard to deny. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle have built lives, brands, and platforms that function independently of the monarchy. That independence has been asserted repeatedly, emphatically. So here's the contradiction that lands quietly but hits hard. If separation is real, why should institutional privileges remain automatic? That's not an emotional question. It's a governance one. And governance questions don't need public sympathy to be answered. They need consensus. They need timing. They need a moment where the cost of acting is lower than the cost of letting ambiguity linger, which suggests something else entirely. That this moment wasn't triggered by a single event, but by the absence of one. No reconciliation, no reset, no return to defined roles. Just a prolonged standoff that slowly clarified itself. At some point, waiting stops being neutral. It becomes risky, and when that happens, institutions don't ask for permission. They move. What's still unclear, and deliberately so, is what internal conclusion finally tipped the balance. What assessment convinced decision-makers that the fallout would be containable? Because once you identify that calculation, the next phase of this story becomes much darker. Not louder, darker. Here's where the conversation usually goes wrong. People talk about titles as if they're decorative, fancy prefixes, old-world formalities that don't really matter in modern life. Something symbolic that can be lost without consequence. That assumption is comforting and misleading. Because if titles were just about ego, this wouldn't be such a careful, calibrated move. The uncomfortable reality is that titles function less like trophies and more like infrastructure. They don't announce their usefulness. They work quietly, in the background, shaping how others respond before a conversation even begins. Think about it. Access isn't usually granted because someone asks loudly. It's granted because the request already carries weight. A title does that work invisibly. It signals legitimacy before credentials are checked. It smooths introductions. It reframes skepticism as curiosity. Remove that, and the environment changes. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But in a way that compounds. This is why the potential stripping of titles hits Prince Harry and Meghan Markle differently than public criticism ever could. Criticism can be answered. Status erosion rarely announces itself, and it can't be argued with. Here's a contradiction worth sitting with. Much of their post-royal identity has been built on independence, financial, emotional, ideological. Yet many of the doors opened to them during that transition were opened because of what they used to represent. That doesn't negate their work, but it complicates the foundation. Because once institutional backing becomes conditional, every interaction subtly shifts. Invitations become cautious. Partnerships more transactional. Interest more conditional on performance rather than association. And that's before you even get to the private implications. Who still returns calls when there's no implied proximity to the crown? Who picks up when influence has to be demonstrated rather than assumed? These aren't questions answered publicly. They're answered in delays, in silence, in polite deferrals that never quite resolve. This is the part no one announces, which makes it more effective. There's also a deeper layer that rarely gets addressed. Titles don't just confer access outward. They offer insulation inward, a kind of buffer. When controversies arise, the institution absorbs some of the shock. Remove that buffer, and every misstep lands directly. Harder, louder, with fewer intermediaries. And suddenly, the idea of freedom looks more complicated. Because independence without insulation is exposure. This is why the bill matters even if it's never used immediately. The possibility alone changes calculations. It introduces uncertainty into spaces that once felt guaranteed. Ask yourself this. How does one build a long-term public identity when the scaffolding beneath it can be legally withdrawn? That question doesn't get answered on camera. It gets answered over time, through momentum gained or lost. And here's the part that makes the next phase of this story unavoidable. Once the safety net is no longer assumed, every future move carries more risk. Every decision becomes heavier. Every silence more noticeable, which raises the question that hasn't been asked out loud yet. What happens if the titles go, and nothing replaces them? Because if that's the scenario being quietly prepared for, then what comes next isn't backlash. It's isolation. So imagine that moment. Not the announcement, not the headlines, but the quiet aftermath. The point where nothing dramatic happens at all. Because if titles are removed, or even if their permanence is simply thrown into doubt, the real consequence is an outrage. It's recalibration. A slow, almost imperceptible shift in how the world responds. This is where the idea of a future without a safety net stops being theoretical. Up until now, there's always been an assumption built into every move that no matter how tense things became, there was still an institutional backstop, a residual gravity tied to the monarchy.